Everyone. Thanks to Roger Perry for the acknowledgement of country. Welcome to our third in-person and online Stoicon-X Melbourne. Thanks to the global modern Stoicism movement, which supports Stoicon-X events around the world. We're very grateful to the Greek Centre, which has hosted us now for the third time. Most of all, thanks to you for supporting Stoicism in Australia by coming along. I know some of you have flown into Melbourne for the event, which is lovely. Many Melburnians are here in force. Can I ask who's here for their very first Stoicon and who's attending for their second or more time? Please take the opportunity to introduce yourself to some people and make community. I'd like to introduce our Stoicon-X Melbourne team. Associate Professor Matthew Sharp of the Australian Catholic University, Roger Perry, CEO of the Bevington Group and Melbourne Stoa, Lin Vu, business owner and Melbourne Stoa, Courtney Shipley of Brisbane Stoics, in business and a practicing counsellor. And I'm Judith Stove, assistant editor of Modern Stoicism's Stoicism Today blog and co-host of Soul Searching with Seneca podcast at the Walled Garden. Today I'm going to give you a very quick intro to Stoicism. Recently, you will have heard, people have been asking how often grown men think about the Roman Empire. Well, pretty often, and it turns out women do too. And if we're in the Stoic community, we tend to think about it many times a day. But why should we go back to ancient Athens and Rome for practical guidance about how best to live our lives in 21st century Australia? The answer is that ancient philosophy turns out to offer helpful frameworks which we can use today. The focus of the ancient philosophical schools was not climbing the academic ladder, there wasn't much of a ladder anyway, it was about teaching people how to live. A stoa is a portico or covered walkway, and in about 300 BCE, a businessman called Zeno, after losing all his stock in a shipwreck, started a school at the painted portico at the marketplace in Athens, called the Stoic or the Portico School. He was heavily influenced by the Cynic philosophers, who in turn had been influenced by Socrates, the teacher of Plato. We know about Socrates from Plato's dialogues and from works by Xenophon. We know that Socrates emphasised a life of virtue and identified the four key, later called cardinal virtues: self-control, courage, justice and wisdom. He lived a philosophical life, trying to find out the truth and realising that people don't have much of an idea about it and often put priority on things which aren't important. I always recommend to people trying to understand the basis of Stoicism that it's well worth having a read of one or two of Plato's shorter dialogues. The main Athens philosophy schools, which were rivals in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, were the Academy, which maintained the traditions from Plato's time, the Lyceum, Aristotle's school, Epicurus's community, and the Stoa. All the schools influenced the others as much as they were rivals. Most of the writings from the very early Stoa have been lost, but there are summaries and fragments which have been assembled in various ways. And a key source is this book, the collection by Diogenes Laertius, which is available in the Lerb edition with the Greek on the left and the English on the right. And it's well worth getting your hands on a physical or digital copy if you can. The schools of Athens influenced people throughout the Mediterranean world, even though the centre of that world, by the 1st century BCE, had shifted to Rome. Most of the Stoic writings which survive are of three later writers: Seneca, from the 1st century Christian era, based in Rome; Epictetus, later in the century, based in Rome until he was exiled to Greece, where he taught; and Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, who spent much of his reign campaigning on the northern frontier of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century of the Christian era. And this is one of my favourite images of Marcus, which was only recently discovered in a hoard on the Yorkshire moors. But we do know enough to have a good idea of the Stoic worldview. The three key interlocking areas of Stoic philosophy are the physics, or scientific account of the world, logic, or forms of reasoning, and ethics. The first two can be very technical, so we don't tend to cover them in meetings such as this, although we will be doing some Stoic natural science in our session on Soul Searching with Seneca. The key principle of Stoic ethics is that virtue is the only good. Now, this can be confronting. It was also a key difference from Aristotle's account, which allowed that other things, such as having friends and a certain income, are necessary for a good life. But for the Stoics, these are called indifferent things, which means they don't make the difference between a life lived well or badly. Remember Socrates? He considered that these things weren't important either, and the Stoics took their cue from him. I can recommend the recent book by Christopher Gill, Learning to Live Naturally, Stoic Ethics and Its Modern Significance, which covers this issue of the so-called indifference and others in great depth. And there is an upcoming event on the 9th of November being organised by Associate Professor Matthew Sharp to discuss the book with Professor Gill himself. Another key principle was that the best kind of life was living according to nature. I discussed this at some length at Stoicon in February 2022, and you can check that out on the Stoics Australia YouTube channel. Living according to nature for the Stoics meant living using our capacity for rational thought, which has been given to us by the gods, and living virtuously. Now, one important tool of living rationally is our power of prohairesis, or choice. When something appears to us a certain way, whether attractive or daunting, we can mentally take a moment to consider whether it truly is that way. The Stoics would say that if we examine prospects before us in this way, we are far more likely to make good judgments about how we should approach them. Another tool is what's commonly known as the dichotomy of control, which is not a great term. Epictetus reminds us to consider what is up to us and what is not up to us, which aspects of a situation are in our power to do something about and which are not. Many things, such as our genes, our physical characteristics, are not in our control. They are a set of givens which would be pointless to complain about. This is a very powerful tool in everyday life, and it's no wonder that for many it's become synonymous with Stoicism. But it can lead us to a rather distorted view of Stoic ethics in focusing on ourselves. Stoicism, rather, is very much concerned with our social lives. We are born as social mammals in a family, and we go to school and work and may eventually start families ourselves. The Stoics saw family love and friendships as absolutely central to human life. Seneca says there is no school more generous. Epictetus says we can't help loving little children. And Marcus Aurelius was a kind, thoughtful friend, father, husband, and leader. This side of Stoicism, which strangely went relatively overlooked until recently, is the subject of an important book by Australian friend of Stoicon, Will Johncock, Beyond the Individual, Stoic Philosophy on Community and Connection, which appeared some time ago but is actually going to be properly launched in coming months in Sydney. This aspect also features in the Christopher Gill book, relying on the writings of Cicero, 1st century BCE, who was not a Stoic but was a thoughtful interpreter of Stoicism. In succeeding history, Stoicism itself has had good times and bad times. In the early modern period, the influence of Stoicism, mainly through Cicero and Seneca, on writers from France and England was profound. Marcus Aurelius also had an influence on many aspects of culture, including on the English novel in the 18th century. But by the mid-20th century, hardly anyone had a good word to say for Stoicism. In the US, it was grudgingly suggested that Stoicism's emphasis on human equality had contributed to modern democracy, but that was all they could say for it. Today, things are different, thanks to the efforts of many scholars in the UK, Europe and USA. And I'm glad to say that here in Australia, that group includes Sydney's Will Johncock and Edward Spence, Associate Professor Matthew Sharp. I should also include the entire Modern Stoicism team, including Donald Robertson, Gregory Sadler, John Sellers, Brittany Polat, who was one of our keynote speakers last year, the Stoicism Today blog, and the Stoic Gym, which comes out every month. And there are also online communities that you can get involved in. There's the Walled Garden Philosophical Community, which is headed up by Simon J. E. Drew, who'll be one of our guests later. The Practical Stoicism Discord, run by Tanner Campbell. There are Facebook groups, Living Stoicism, Zenonian, Traditional Stoicism, Brisbane Stoics, Let's Read, Philosophy, Literature and Psychotherapy, and Stoa Antipodia, just to name a few.